In the water cycle, or sometimes we call it the hydrological cycle, essentially the same thing. So what it means is how the fresh water is circulating in the earth. So in the water cycle, we only look at the freshwater circulation. So not including the ice, not including, even though ice is also freshwater, not including the sea or the ocean circulation, because that is for the coastal environment. It's not for the river environment. So basically, in the water cycle, we have three major parts. The first part is the input, meaning it is precipitation only. So precipitation has three types. The first type is rainfall, the most common type. The second one is snowfall, and the third one is hail. Meaning it's small ice-like particles. So in Hong Kong, we don't have hail basically that often. I think one time we did was a few years ago. The first part of the water cycle, we call it input, meaning input to the system. It's like whatever system, we have input, processes, and output. So for the input in the water cycle, we say it's a closed system. Then, meaning whatever happened inside the system stays inside the system. It's just like secret, right? Whatever happened in this meeting stays in this meeting. Like you cannot leak it to someone else. You cannot leak it outside. So for the input, it is the water input to the water cycle, the whole system. And then we have different processes for how the rainfall, after its input, how it changes in different processes. And then finally, we have output. So output, we also have one single word. We call that evapotranspiration, meaning it's how the water is leaving the land. And then eventually, after evapotranspiration, it becomes precipitation again after condensation. So for the output, evapotranspiration, it consists of two processes. One is transpiration, the other one is evaporation. So probably you know evaporation quite well. It's rather straightforward. Simply, it's the change of state from water vapor, from liquid form to water vapor, meaning from liquid form to gas form because of the increase in temperature. So that is evaporation. And then transpiration is a little bit complex. So example you can think of would be respiration for animal species. Just like you and I, we will breathe in and breathe out, right? So if you do a small experiment, you go to the window or you go to in front of a mirror and you breathe out and then so you are going to breathe out both air and moisture, right? You see some moisture on the mirror or on the window because that is when we breathe out, the air coming out is a bit moist from the human body. So that is changing the water vapor into liquid once the water vapor is in contact with the cold surface, that is the mirror or the window. So that also explains the process of condensation, meaning it's the opposite of evaporation. So evaporation is the change of state from liquid to gas form. Condensation is the opposite. It's the change of water from the vapor form, the gas form, back to the liquid form, meaning it's the watery form. So how does that work? Is that as the air particles and the water particles, water vapor, rises further up into the atmosphere, the temperature, air temperature decreases as the altitude increases. So what happens is, as the temperature drops, the water vapor cools down. When it cools down, it condenses, become basically the water form. So it's just the change of state for water, okay? So basically we have covered both the input and the output, right? So you can see after precipitation. Let's start with input again from the whole process. After precipitation, the rainfall will hit the ground, right? Depending on the land surface, sometimes the rainfall just hit the barren land surface, like just hit the ground. It's like rainfall, right? You see on the ground water hitting the whatever surface. So when the rainwater hits the ground and flows along the land surface, we have the process called overland flow, meaning it's very straightforward. It's water flowing over the land. We call it overland flow. Very straightforward. And then it is part of the surface runoff, because surface runoff is all the water flowing on the land surface. We call that surface runoff. Eventually, we say that if there's a river nearby, there are nearby river, and the overland flow can flow into the river. So when the rainwater hits the ground, it becomes overland flow. And when the water is flowing on the land, eventually, maybe it will reach the river. And when the rainwater flowing on top of the land reach the river, it becomes channel flow. So from overland flow becomes channel flow. So both of them combined becomes surface runoff, meaning whatever water flowing on top of the Earth's surface, that is called surface runoff. Good? Okay, so how about if it's not hitting the land directly? What happens if there's some vegetation? Because here in the water cycle, we are talking about in nature, natural environment. So we discount all the human urban environment. So there's no man-made structure in nature in its purest form, basically. So we discount all the artificial land. So if it is not over the land, then probably it will be hitting vegetation cover. For example, trees, grass, flowers, whatever vegetation. So if it's not hitting the soil, not hitting the rock, then it's probably hitting some kind of vegetation, right? Or hitting the river directly. That becomes channel flow directly. So we also discount the sea. The lake is counted in the river, and we also discount the ice surface for now, to keep it simple. So basically, if it's not hitting the land, soil, or rock, it's going to be hitting vegetation cover, trees, grass, flower, whatever. So when the rainwater hits the vegetation cover, something happens. We call that interception. So imagine if it's raining now. You open the window, stick your hand out, then your hand will get wet because you are intercepting the rainwater when the rainwater is on its way to the ground. It's like in football, right? You intercept someone's pass. That's called interception. Same in basketball, right? So basically, the tree leaves or the grass, surface of the grass, or whatever vegetation cover, they trap the rainwater on its way to the land. So we call that interception. What happens is, after interception, when that leaf surface is gathering or accumulating rainwater, eventually, because it's not secure, not very stable, it's just attached to the tree branches. And then probably it will drop, or the rainwater will slide through the leaf surface. So that process is called drip flow. Over here, you can see drip flow. When the rainwater on the leaf surface is no longer on the leaf surface, basically sliding down onto the land, continuing its way to the land. So that is called drip flow. Okay, so what happens is, when the rainwater is not hitting the leaves, what happened to the rainwater? So sometimes we have the tree trunk, right? The tree trunk also is quite big. So when the rainwater is hitting the tree trunk directly and it's flowing down the tree trunk, we call that stem flow. Basically, it's like if you take a shower, you splash water onto the wall, and water flowing down the wall is like that process. It's like stem flow. Maybe if you're doing that experiment, you can call that wall flow, but which is not something in the hydrological cycle. Anyway, so after stem flow or drift flow, sometimes the rainwater will infiltrate. We call that infiltration. So why does that happen? Because as the rainwater flow down the tree trunk, some of the water will just follow the pattern of the tree. Let's say from the trunk all the way through the tree roots into the soil, because the tree roots are connecting the tree from the earth surface to the soil. So basically there are some pathway connecting the surface to the soil. So when the rainwater is flowing down the tree trunk, eventually some of the water will flow along the tree roots into the soil. Or sometimes the rainwater simply hits the ground, let's say overland flow, right? And while it's flowing, because the surface is porous, meaning water can penetrate, it's also permeable. Water can penetrate, right? So eventually some water will infiltrate. It's like if you go to the beach and you try to splash some water to the beach surface, the water will seep into the sand. It's gone, right? So, or sometimes if you just do flowering or perform irrigation, then you will see when you pour the water to the land, it gets absorbed by the soil. It's actually not being absorbed by the soil actively, but it's simply the water goes through the spaces between the soil particles into the soil underground. Okay. So after infiltration, we have two processes. The water now becomes like no longer rainwater, right? The water now is in the unsaturated soil, so right below the ground surface. Why we call it unsaturated? Because if it is saturated, it cannot absorb more water. So give you an example. If you have a piece of cotton, dry cotton, and you drop some water onto it, then the water gets absorbed by the piece of cotton, right? Because that piece of cotton is unsaturated, meaning it can still absorb more. It's like if you are hungry, you go to a restaurant, you can eat, right? You can consume the food because you're still hungry. So unsaturated is like you are hungry, so you can eat. So back to the concept of the cotton. So now, if it is saturated, what does that mean? It's like you put that piece of cotton into a cup of water. You just soak it with water and you take it out and it's dripping water, like it's soaking wet. Meaning, in your case, probably you have finished a buffet and you have eaten a lot and you say, no, I cannot eat more, I'm very full. So that state is saturated, meaning the soil can no longer absorb more water. So where does that happen? It is actually happening below the water table. So the water table is the imaginary line, or basically a section of the ground where is separating the unsaturated soil above and the saturated soil below. Because the water table is like a table, basically, made of water. So it is the highest level of groundwater underground. So imagine if you want to dig a well. Let's say you are in a rural village. You want to dig a well for water supply. Then you have to dig deep enough to the water table in order to tap water. Because if you just dig, let's say 5 meters down the land surface, still unsaturated soil, chances are you're only going to get some mud or soil particles, not going to get water out enough to be drinkable. But if you continue to dig deep enough to the water table, meaning you're now tapping into the underground water or simply groundwater. So you can see over here. So the groundwater is where the unsaturated soil, is where the saturated soil is found. So unsaturated soil with just particles, meaning you can still add more water. Saturated soil is below the water table where we find the groundwater. So when the water from the unsaturated soil is going through the water table, that process is called percolation. If not, it's just flowing sideways in the unsaturated soil, then we call that process through flow. Rather simple, and you won't be tested about this idea that often, so no worry. And then, what happens after percolation? What happens to the water, groundwater? They will also flow in the saturated layer, as in the process of base flow or groundwater flow. So just like surface runoff, we also have water flowing below the Earth's surface, and we call that subsurface runoff. Basically, opposite to surface runoff, we have subsurface. It's like subway because it's underground. It's also like submarine. Why we call it sub? Because it's underground, under the surface. Submarine would be under the water surface, right? So it's the same. Here we call that subsurface runoff. Okay? So after we have all this flow, remember we have output, right? So if it is evaporation, we say it is all the water changing from liquid form to gas form on all surfaces on Earth except vegetation. So if we get water from soil, from rock, from the river, from the sea, we call that evaporation, the output of those surfaces, evaporation. But if it is from the vegetation cover, and vegetation cover only, we call that transpiration. Just now we talk about like respiration. When the vegetation breathe out, they also carry out respiration, right? Because in the daytime, with sunlight, vegetation or plants carry out photosynthesis. But in the nighttime, without sunlight, they actually perform the opposite, like respiration, just like animal species. So they take in oxygen and releases carbon dioxide in the nighttime. So you can think of transpiration as something like human respiration or animal respiration, in the form that the vegetation is releasing water moisture or water vapor. So when we combine it, it becomes the word evapotranspiration. So that is the whole water cycle.